Hi folks, welcome to lecture 2 of International Political Economy. So today we're going to be talking about the emergence of capitalism and mercantilism. So this is the course outline, so 10 lectures, and so today we're looking at mercantilism and empire. And so we're going to, in this course, we're going to cover the entire evolution of global economics or international political economy, right? From very early on to the present day. So this is an outline of this lecture, and you will find that I'm putting this whole course in a very historical context, right? Have to know where we've come from and why things have changed, so that we might be able to get a hint as to what might be coming next and what to do about it. So all of the systems that we're going to talk about are systems of organization and strategy, systems of thinking about strategy, and systems about thinking about and organizing economics. Okay. All right. So how did we get capitalism? So I'll give you the agricultural version first, the agrarian version. So this story starts. Well, there's probably always been trade, right? But you know, I'll trade you this pot for that bale of wheat or something, right? But that's not just trade is not capitalism, right? The accumulation of capital so the accumulation of capital has always probably happened as well, right? People collect, cows or food or gold and gems, etc., right? So kings, sit on a lot of gold and whatever, right? But what makes capitalism is that it's the idea that reinvesting your capital, reinvesting your profits in order to make more profits, to make more money, right? This reinvesting, that is actually something fairly new, right? Lots of research has been done on where states have come from, and this system of government, and how did we go from hunter-gatherers to chiefs and kings and queens, and eventually this immensely complex thing called we call a state. So how did that begin to happen, right? So we'll start this story at the agricultural revolution, right? So people start settling down to farm instead of being hunter-gatherers. And this obviously leads to a bit of a increase in population and that sort of thing. You've got a steady supply of food, hopefully. But the problem with that is that it means you as a farmer are very vulnerable to bandits coming in, killing and stealing all your food, right? Or even if they aren't killed, repeated bandits stealing all your food means you starve to death anyway, right? However, eventually the clever bandits realize that instead of stealing all the farmers' food, they should leave them some so that they can survive and they can keep farming, and the bandit can come back and steal some more next year, right? But this strategy means that they have to stop other bandits coming and stealing the rest of the food as well, right? So you have the start of what the economist Mancur Olson called stationary bandits, right? Where bandits stop being roving and become attached to a piece of land and a set of farmers and protecting them from other bandits so that they can steal repeatedly from them. So if you were talking about the mafia, you would call this a protection racket, right? The mafia will protect your store from getting burnt down by, nasty criminals. But if you don't pay, then the mafia will burn down your shop, right? So, and this sort of protection racket builds up over the years. Stationary bandits are defeated by other bigger bandits, and through a process of consolidation, you get little bandits being given land and peasants by a bigger bandit. And this evolved in Britain and Europe and Japan and everywhere into a patchwork of territory controlled by violence, by the local manor lord or shogun or etc. And the people that were attached to the land became serfs or peasants, or so serfs being slaves, but even the peasants, they needed to pay the manorial lord a share of, or would give him all of the crop, and the lord would let them stay on the land and eat and etc. Right? And when the king, or the biggest bandit or whatever, when he needed to defend his territory from other bandits or expand it, his vassal lords, so his henchmen, his tough guys, his knights, would have to come and fight for him. So initially, the strongest bandit would have been the best fighter, right? The best at violence. These are entrepreneurs in violence, right? But as the generations pass, the hierarchy becomes mostly hereditary, right? The king hands it down to his son, and the lords hand their manors down to their sons, and etc., etc. And so you get further and further away from kings actually leading the fight to being, not doing that at all, right? And so, at least initially, the biggest, baddest bandit, who is the best at fighting, gets to call himself the king, right? And he doesn't have to justify it anyway, except he's the biggest, baddest bandit, right? And if you question it, he'll kill you. But as it becomes hereditary, that justification is replaced, but needs to be replaced, right? Why does the king have this authority? Because his great grandfather won a battle, right? It's got nothing to do with him. So it's been replaced by religion, right? So it's what's called the divine right of kings, right? This, why does the king have this authority and power and riches and wealth? Because he's been chosen by God to lead and rule, this country, this kingdom, right? So, so in this feudal system where each lord has a village and a set of serfs, and there's some peasants, and there might be a local blacksmith that's or a baker or something like that are not serfs, they're not slaves, but all in all, the whole thing is fairly self-contained within these small villages, right? and what trade there was pretty limited, right? The king would get a share of everything, as all mafia organisations do. Things are passed up the line, but the amount of trade was fairly limited. So what changed that is that there was a series of, there was a great famine from 1315 to 1317 that killed millions, but all through sort of Europe and Britain. But then the bubonic plague, so the Black Death, came to Europe in 1347. So it's come from Asia along the Silk Road. So it's been transported by trade, right? And this devastated the world and Europe. It's estimated to have killed between 30 and 60% of all people in Europe. So that's half of everyone, right? It's like a Thanos balancing of everything, right? 50-60% of people dying in Europe, and it's reduced the world's population from around 500 million down to 350 million, around there. So apocalyptic, right? And it's often discussed as though the bubonic plague came and then went away, after 10 years, right? So it's often discussed between these dates of 1346 and 1353. But actually, the Black Death became endemic, right? So it reoccurred every year, like our flu or chickenpox or whatever, right? So the Black Death was a continual, devastating contagion for the next 200 years, right? All the way through the Renaissance. It was like a universal thing to have family members die or friends die of the plague, right? And the yellow flag above, on a ship or outside of a village or city was a common sight, right? Telling people that there's plague here and to stay away, right? And that the bubonic plague was really a terrible blight all the way up from 1348 to up to 1720s, when the plague finally diminished in Europe, not because of any advance in medicine, right? But because so many generations, I mean, that's probably something like 10 or 15 generations of exposure and being killed off, it finally gave natural selection a chance to, the people that are left have an immune response to this this plague, and so defensive adaptation over 200 years, right, over 2 centuries, and millions of deaths, right. Finally, the bubonic plague was no longer a problem, right? So, so that's 200 years of really brutal stuff, right? But this Black Plague had very important implications for the balance of power between lords and serfs. So this huge depopulation of the world changed these power dynamics, between the feudal lords and their serfs and peasants, because the value of labour skyrocketed, right? The Black Plague effectively ended feudalism in Britain and eventually all of Europe, because serfs were able to bargain for their freedom and become tenants, right? And tenants kept what they produced and only paid, rent, right, rather than, not owning anything of what they produced. So what this means is it changes the incentives. Suddenly there's a desire to farm more efficiently and develop labour-saving devices, and this led to the most industrious tenants or ex-serfs being able to consolidate larger and larger leases, and then so lots of people were actually forced off the land, right? And the ranks of lords were hit hard too. Lots of them died, so there's a consolidation of the land ownership, and so as part of that, you had 100 years of slowly removing the common land rights for peasants, where they were allowed to grow grain or grass for herds on portions of land around a village, right? But as the consolidation of land increased, individual lords were able to force through laws where they were able to seize all of the common land, and so that was called enclosure acts, and they came in through Britain and Europe from the 1760s onwards, and so that forced a huge amount of people off the land, right? But at least in Britain, the Industrial Revolution was kicking off in the cities, and the incoming labour was put to work using steam-powered machines to produce manufactured goods on a very large scale, right? But the thing is this time, even though they went to work in horrible conditions, right? People being turned into machines, right? But they were paid in wages, right? And theoretically, they could quit and go work elsewhere, right? So these factories where capital was being reinvested, not just in buying goods where they are cheap and moving them to where they are expensive to sell, right? So not just trade, but instead it was capital that was being reinvested in production, right? So this is something new, right? And so what Marx would soon call controlling the means of production, right? We started to see that because of the shift in the increase in the value of labour and the enclosement and the increasing efficiency of agriculture and the end of the feudal system. The end of the feudal system wasn't all good, right, for the little guy, right? The little guy got forced out of his home because serfdom was no longer allowed, right? So he gets turfed on the street and has to go work in a horrible factory, right? So this isn't an unalloyed triumph for the little guy or anything, but we do see the start of the capitalist system where it's not just money being put under the mattress, right? But it's being reinvested in increasing the amount of production you can do. Yeah. So that's the agricultural version of where capitalism came from. The other is the merchant capitalist story. But before we get to that version, it's really important to understand where states came from, because mercantilism, in a very real sense, is states competing economically states competing in a capitalist system, right? So, to understand where one system came from, you need to understand where the state system comes from as well. Okay, so the story of where we get states from is really a story about how Europeans started questioning the authority and power of priests and the Pope and and really all of religion eventually, and even then the monarchy and kings, and it's really a part of the whole Enlightenment story. But we'll just focus on how we got the current system of sovereign states. So by 1050 AD, Christianity or Catholic Christianity had spread all through Europe, Britain, Ireland, or up to the Volga for Russia, all through Turkey and the Middle East, and along the northern tip of North Africa. So within this area, all the kings, all the dukes, all the lords, all of their authority comes from the Pope, right? Because the priesthood here is anointing these kings with what we can call the divine right of kings, or it was known as the divine right of kings. And so again, you've got this repeating pattern of priests justifying the social structure. Why does the king have the authority of life and death? Or because his divine right, his right is divine. He is the hand of God amongst the people. So by 1050, you've got this massive area of that has been converted to Catholic Christianity. There's no such thing as Protestant yet, but so this is all Catholic. And if you questioned the ridiculous, illogical theology of, or the belief structure, the rules of Catholicism, that would usually end very badly for you. If you questioned the Catholic doctrines, you would very likely end up before an inquisitor, and they would sentence you to being tortured until you either admitted being a witch or a representative of Satan, or died, right? So very, very brutal stuff, right? So not just the Aztecs, right? All religion can turn into have this really brutal side. If you're not sacrificing people to the gods for good crops, you're punishing people for being heretics. Right? So, of course, the Inquisitions were very successful in finding heretics and witches and people working for Satan, right? Because that was the only way to make the torture stop, was to sign a confession, right? So fast forward to 1517, and a priest called Martin Luther writes a series of essays challenging the corruption in the Catholic Church, mainly the selling of what was called indulgences, where you would pay money. If you paid a great deal of money to the church, you could buy forgiveness from God and salvation for your eternal soul, and you could buy a ticket into heaven. And so this was seen as very corrupt by Martin Luther, and he wrote a series of essays questioning where this was in the Bible, and where this was in the teachings of Jesus or whatever, and so he was challenging the authority of the Pope and the priests by introducing the idea of, instead of this hierarchical priesthood, all the power coming from the Pope, he introduced the idea of the priesthood of all believers. Right, so everyone is a priest. Everyone has direct access to God through prayer and that sort of thing. And you could have a personal relationship with God. You didn't need your relationship with God to have an intermediary, such as the Pope or the priests. You didn't need the church as an intermediary. And so this set off a series of, and so this is the nailing of the 95 Theses on the church door. Probably didn't actually happen that way. He is probably much more likely to have mailed his essays to archbishops and maybe even the Pope. Right? But his ideas sparked off a series of rebellions and civil wars by princes and kings throughout Europe that ended up spanning 100 years. And lots of these wars may have been sparked by different interpretations of theology, but they were driven by, or at least quickly became driven by who controls what. Okay. So despite the Protestant Reformation being triggered by a Martin Luther writing his 95 Theses attacking the Catholic Church on theological grounds, that challenge to the Pope's authority became driven by who gets what. The real driving force that spread this Reformation to the entire Europe and destroyed the central lands of Germany, brought famine and morphed into the 30 Years' War that engulfed all of Europe. The driving factor, why this really kicked off, what drove it, was that all the kings and princes and lords all had to pay money to the Pope, right? Like a spiritual protection racket. But here was a chance to say, oh no, I believe in the priesthood of all believers, so that means I don't have to pay taxes to the church, and it's really that dynamic, right? That it spread from this internal theological debate within the Catholic Church to being driven by princes and kings rebelling against needing to pay taxes. Okay. So the original or the Protestant Reformation kicks off really with the Peasants' War of 1525, and these are this revolt has a lot to do with revolting against the church and local kings that kept raising their taxes, trying to force people into serfdom, right? If you couldn't pay your taxes, then you would have to go into slavery, into serfdom, to either the church or the local king or lord. And so this triggered a revolt, and this merged with the ideas of Luther, and then you saw actual kings rebelling against each other. It was an advantage for you if you wanted to break your tax, if you wanted to get out of paying taxes, not only to the Pope but to maybe the king in the next valley, then all you had to do is say, oh, actually, I no longer believe in the Pope and the Church, and you do, so I'm not going to pay my tithes to you either. Right? So you had this real shattering of the medieval lines of authority, and it quickly morphed into what's now known as the 30 Years' War, which drew in all the major, all of European states, all the kingdoms, and even the Ottoman Empire. So it quickly became a land grab as well. But because of the religious motivation or justification that it was at the heart of it, it was a very, very, very vicious war. Lots of so it would be the next town over is Catholic. Let's round up everyone and let's ride over to the next valley and hang everyone, right? So, and take everything they have, right? Because they're no longer human. They're heretics. They're Satan worshippers. They're being inspired by the devil. They're trying to bring down the church, right? So this religious aspect of the war made it really, really brutal and with no mercy shown to opposing forces or civilians, right? And destroyed the centre of Europe, the German territories, brought famine to most of the area as well, and all through Europe. Really bloody chapter in European history, right? As the church schismed. So while all this is happening, you've got 100 years of war from the start of the Protestant Reformation to the Peace of Westphalia, and brutal, horrible war, right? Completely devastating to all of Europe and Christendom, really. And while this is going on, you've got a lawyer named Hugo Grotius starts writing about a society of states and an international society that could be governed not by force but by the rule of law. Laws that everyone had mutually agreed to enforce. So breaking from this idea of empire being the way you run, how states relate to each other, but actually a society of equal states. So not a hierarchy like an empire, but a society of equal states. And at the heart of this idea was this concept of sovereignty. So Grotius's book and ideas form the basis of the treaties that were signed to end the 100 Years of War, the Peace Treaties of Westphalia, where a representative from every king in the whole of Europe signed, and this document sets the rules for the international system of states that we have today, right? The Peace of Westphalia is what created this system that we are operating in now, and it is a momentous event, not only for that, but because of two aspects to the to the treaties, right? At the heart of them, firstly, it created the sovereignty of each state. So in this context, that meant each prince or king had the right to choose the religion of the people within his borders and what they would follow. Plus, any minority group who had to be allowed to practice their religion without persecution. So this is the very start of religious freedom and minority rights. Secondly, it made it illegal to use religion as a justification for war. Religion's goal of converting people is no longer allowed to be the state's goal, right? Because the state has military power, right? So from this treaty, you weren't allowed to use the state to convert people. So this is the very start of the separation of church and state. So the age-old deal between priests and kings was broken in this treaty, right? This is the dethroning of religion and separating church and state. And it's created this this system of sovereign states that we have today. And so this is easily one of the most important events in human history. And this challenging of the divine justification for the rule of kings can be seen as a key aspect of the English and French revolutions that eventually ended the power of kings as well, right? So here we've got the first challenging of the authority structure, getting rid of the priests, the kings separating themselves from the priests, and then eventually the challenge to the king's authority was able to be done as well. However, beneath these wars, right, beneath this 100 years of war, beneath these physical conflicts, there was an intellectual challenge to the power of the priests happening, right? These wars can be seen as a physical manifestation of the deeper philosophical conflict that was being fought. The deeper war was over the justification for the power of priests and kings to rule over us. So it was a war between, should we believe things on faith, right? So with no evidence, or do we need to have evidence and use rationality for the things we believe? And so this 100 Years' War and the Peace of Westphalia is easily one of the most important events in human history, even if it is very Eurocentric. It has set the scene for the global system that we have today. Okay, so normally on telling that story of state sovereignty, the Reformation, etc., as part of a larger story of the Enlightenment, and I would then go on to explain how at the same time as all these physical wars were going on, that sort of distracted the powers that be and allowed this revolution in science to come about as well. And so I would detail the beginnings of the scientific method and that sort of thing. So, but in this course, international political economy, I'll leave that and we'll move on to the the origin of capitalism, the mercantilist version. Okay. So, as at the same time as the 30 Years' War was going on, global trade shifted to the sea, right? So it used to be just that the Silk Road from China bringing silk and spices as well was really the only long range sort of global trade you could really speak of, right? But the extreme rarity of spices like pepper and cloves and nutmeg and cinnamon and sugar, imagine discovering sugar for the first time. So these things were not available in the cold north, of the European states, right? So rich people would pay a lot of money for them. And so super rare, exceptionally valuable in Europe. And at the time, a small pouch of spices could easily buy you, a herd of cattle or sheep or something like that, right? The Portuguese were the first to find routes, a spice trade route to India and beyond. And by the 16th century, so thanks to what's his name, Vasco da Gama, who discovered the sea route to the East Indies in the 1490s. The Portuguese, so Catholic Portugal, mostly traded the commodities with the Protestant countries of Northern Europe, and really dominated the spice trade. That changed in 1580 when there was a war with England and the Low Countries, so the Netherlands and Belgium and Luxembourg, and the trade of spices was cut, right? And so, desperate to get a bit of a foothold in this lucrative global spice trade, the newly formed Dutch Republic recruited spies who fed back information from the Portuguese trips to Asia. So maps of the secret sea routes and local customs and weather conditions and intel on how strong the Portuguese navy were in certain locations, and through this they deduced that the ongoing war the Portuguese were fighting with the English really had weakened them, right? So the spice trade was there for the taking, right? And so in 1602, the Dutch began raiding Portuguese trading posts, sinking Portuguese warships and seizing the cargo ships that they were escorting, and went to war with Portugal for the next 60 years, actually, and several major coups, major battles where they were able to seize whole fleets of cargo ships, full of spices, really, was a huge victory and a huge defeat. Huge victory for the Dutch and a huge defeat for the Portuguese. And so from 1602, the Dutch were able to dominate the spice trade. So on the left here is a picture of the courtyard of the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, so the first stock exchange in the world. And the story, why the story of Dutch spice trade is important, is that so there were a number of Dutch companies that were competing for the spice trade, and that meant prices fluctuated a lot and profits were cut because they were competing, right? So to stabilise this, the Dutch Republic forcibly amalgamated the rival firms to form a cartel in 1602, and which was really copying what the British did with the English East India Company. So the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC, because I can't say the Dutch, but it's in Dutch the abbreviation is VOC. The key difference between the British and the Dutch version of their East India companies was how it was financed. So the Dutch East India Company started with a capital of millions and millions, right? So because they did a public offering of stock in this now amalgamated set of shipping companies, right? And so they were able to raise an enormous amount of money from the public lending them money, right, in the form of shares, right? And even so, credit is a very key part of the development of capitalism, or really development in full stop, right? It's very hard to build anything of scale if you can't borrow against future income, right? But here, the Amsterdam Stock Exchange did a public offering, and it was very well supported, right? So, the VOC was the first company to sell stocks to the general public, conducting the world's first proper IPO in 1602, raising a lot of capital. So the minimum investment was 3,000 guilders, which works out to around $195,000 if adjusted for inflation, right? So no, not a small investment, right? But the company's profits soared really quickly, and they were able to pay out large dividends to their investors. And so the entire country is investing in this East India Company, right? And the Dutch-Portuguese War ended in 1663 with the Portuguese controlling Brazil and Angola and Macau, and the Dutch controlling the strategically important Cape of Good Hope, or Cape Town, and all of the East Indies, which we now call Southeast Asia and Indonesia. So by 1669, the VOC had become the wealthiest company in the world in terms of assets, and the firm had more than 150 enormous merchant ships, 40 massive warships, and outposts throughout Asia and parts of Africa. It had a workforce of 50,000, along with a private army of 10,000 soldiers, right? And their headquarters in Amsterdam was like a palace, and its success made Amsterdam the wealthiest city in Europe, and they were the first stock bubble and crash too, when the VOC brought back tulips from the east and started the tulip craze that burst, but they survived that. And for 200 years, the Dutch were the dominant sea power in Europe, right? Because we have a fairly English bias in our history. we tend to think of the British being the dominant sea power, but first it was the Dutch, right? They controlled all the spice trade, and the VOC remains one of the wealthiest companies in human history, right? By some accounts, it's if you adjust for inflation, then it's still the wealthiest company in history, right? Depending on how you do the counting. But starting in 1670, the French and the Danish began to open up spice routes of their own, breaking the Dutch monopoly. And so the market for spices became flooded and margins decreased, and corruption and theft grew within the company, within VOC, as did the company's debts. But the directors kept paying out generous dividends, so their debts blew out and their margins are crashing after 200 years of dominating the world. And between 1677 and 1755, the VOC got bogged down in costly wars of succession in Indonesia. Indonesia was their colony, and there was a series of wars of succession for local leaders. And there was a series of 4 wars with the English between 1652 and 1784, where the British finally dealt them a crushing blow, destroying half their fleet and losing many of their key bases in Southeast Asia. And this left them weak before a rampaging Napoleon, who invaded and conquered the Dutch Republic in 1795. And so the VOC crumpled under its massive load of debt, and having all its assets seized at home, and its fleets destroyed at sea. And so the VOC, the richest company in human history by some counts, was liquidated in 1799. So that is a super condensed story of the real first multinational company that was funded by a public listed stock float, and that's the capitalism here is the way the trade was financed, right? The public investing in a publicly traded company. So the lending based on future returns is the key, and this is a huge advance in and of itself, right? You can't really get far without the idea of credit, but the VOC really took it to another level, so that rather than each person trying to finance their own ship, investors got to invest in a company with a fleet of ships, so you reduce the risk of sinkings, plus you increase the profits, right? And so this is a key beginning of capitalism, right? So again, I'll say that capitalism distinguishes capital from wealth, right? So wealth is just spending money on stuff, whereas capital is money or goods or resources invested and reinvested in increasing the production, right, of trade, of goods, and ultimately of profits, right? So we see that in the agricultural version and in the merchant version. And what makes capitalism is the idea that you can invest your money to make more. And it probably took 100 years for that idea to really take hold, but and it just simply wasn't around before the 1300s, right? Like, you just didn't have this idea of reinvesting things, right? Kings would go out and seize more territory to create wealth, but there was no investing in better ways of doing things or bigger anything, right? And so that changed. But unlike the dynamics producing waged labour in the agricultural and industrial revolution markets, this merchant capitalism, right, or mercantilism, influenced the state and its foreign policy in a way that the agricultural changes didn't, right? So mercantilism is a particular idea about how you make profits for the state, right? So mercantilism is built on the idea that the amount of wealth in the world is finite, right? Like there's a limited amount, and so trade becomes a competition, a zero-sum competition, right? Like my increasing wealth has to be taken from you, right? It's a zero-sum competition. We both can't get rich. And you can see how this idea took hold, right? We're talking about the 1400s, to the 1700s, where war was constant in Europe, right? And the wars were usually over controlling resources and the trade and profits that they generated. So the Dutch had no spices, right? So this forces them to go and get some. They can't trade with anyone else. They have to go and find the source and set up a colony. And this you can see how this naturally generates sort of empires as they seek to control the sources of wealth. So the Dutch are fighting the British, who are fighting the French, and everybody's fighting everyone for resources. This zero-sum game, right? If the French control sugar plantations in southern India, the Dutch don't, right? Or the British don't, right? It's a zero-sum game. So this search for resources expands into empire. The economics books of the time were mainly written by these merchant soldiers. So it's understandable that economics and trade in particular was seen in terms of war. And so the strategy for the mercantilists was to subsidize domestic production, right? Set very high tariffs on imports, or to ban imports altogether, and sell as much as you can and buy as little as you can. Mercantilism is really the economics of realism, if you've done other international relations subjects. So realism sees the world as a zero-sum game in terms of security and power, and mercantilism sees economics as a zero-sum game. My gain is your loss. And in a world where wealth was really thought of as gold and other precious metals, then the amount of wealth in the world really was kind of fixed, right? So perhaps they had a point. So this is the list of this is the 9-point program that the Austrian lawyer and scholar Philipp Wilhelm von Horneck, he wrote a 9-point plan for how to run an economy for the Austrians in his book called Austria Overall If She Only Will, right, in 1684. And so this is the first sort of comprehensive summary of the ideas of mercantilism. Right? You can pause the video and have a quick read of them. Okay, so I hate just reading out slides. Much better for you to pause it and read it yourself. Okay, so you can see from that it is underneath of it is the idea that we can't let go of any gold or silver, right? We just got to keep it all, right? And it circulates in our own our own economy, but we can't let it escape and go elsewhere. So colonies were the sources of raw material, including slaves. You know, I don't want to paint the the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, as anything but a horrible blight on the indigenous peoples that it came across. It enslaved millions probably, and so colonies were a source of raw materials, and they were also markets for the manufactured goods that the newly industrializing Europeans were producing. Right? And so this led to what became known as the triangular trade dynamic between 1451 and 1870, where ships would sail from Europe to Africa, exchange the manufactured goods for slaves, then sail to the colonies in North America, and exchange the slaves for raw materials, which would then be returned to be sold to European factories to be turned into more manufactured goods, right? And this was the triangular trade in the 1700s. So while mercantilism is a form of capitalism, right? It's really the first form of it, I suppose. But it's state directed, right? It is in essence economic warfare by states. The Dutch and the French, the British, the Spanish, all had an East India Company, and they were using trade and capitalist reinvestment in order to strengthen the state for the continual wars they were fighting, right? And so this is not free trade, right? This is the opposite of free trade. And so they're not trading goods, they're trading artillery, right? So these mercantilist policies were driven by the need to prepare and fight constant wars, but they also caused it, right? The thinking that trade is that wealth is fixed, right, and that and trade is a zero-sum game, right? So it really, that concept forces the searching for resources that the home state doesn't have, and seizing territory and expanding into empire and then defending the empire, and it generates war, right? It's not free trade at all. And the disturbing aspect, or a disturbing aspect of this disturbing story, is that the world seems to be returning to a modern version of mercantilism. Right? In 2016, we saw Brexit and the election of Trump. Both seem to be driven by concerns that free trade and globalization were hurting the working class in Britain and America. Trump pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade agreement that the Obama administration had been pushing for years, and since 2018, Trump has actually started a very serious trade war with China that I'm sure you're all aware of. So, is this a return to mercantilism and a retreat from free trade, right? It certainly seems to be. Trump ran on an anti-Chinese trade platform using very, very extreme language. Let me play this clip for you.
Following morning, I got a call at 11:30 in the evening by the $500 billion deficit, trade deficit with China. We're going to turn it around, and we have the cards. Don't forget, we're like the piggy bank that's being robbed. We have the cards. We have a lot of power with China. When China doesn't want to fix the problem in North Korea, we say, sorry, folks, you got to fix the problem. because we can't continue to allow China to rape our country, and that's what they're doing. It's the greatest theft in the history of the world.
So Trump has run on this extraordinarily vicious, anti-China rhetoric, right? Like the greatest theft in the history of the world and raping our country, like just extraordinarily extreme language, right? So let's have a look at what is Trump's problem, or what's this trade war about, right? What's America's problem? So first is the trade deficit, right? And it is significant, right? It is very large, and it's started a little bit with the opening up and the reforms that the Chinese brought in the early 90s that we talked about in other lectures, but then really kicked off in early 2000s, where so 2001, I think, China was admitted to the WTO, and so that gives them it lowers a whole lot of tariffs that it would normally be there, and so since then it's really rocketed along to extraordinary amounts, right? So that's a real thing. The next one is IP theft. So part of the WTO deal was that they would bring in and protect intellectual property rights, right? Part of the WTO treaty is called TRIPS, Treaty on Intellectual Property Protection. So that's all supposed to be baked in, right? But protecting Western companies protecting their IP in China is a joke, right? It's not happening. And in fact, there are forced IP transfers, right? So if you go and set up a factory in any developing country, really, it is quite normal for the government to require any corporation to have a local partner that really runs the business, right? Has some control over the business. But that is different from what is very unusual is China has policies where they not only do you have to have a partnership agreement with a local firm, but you have to that partner also gets all the IP rights, right? Which is extremely unusual, right? And it's amazing that companies have still gone there, right? Like the short-term profit motive is amazing, right? So they go there and give all their intellectual property, all their technology, and the right to use it, right, to their Chinese partners. It's amazing. And the other really big problem is the massive amount of subsidies that Chinese companies get. If you're any sort of large employer, you have subsidized transport. You'll get loans that you don't really need to pay back, and that's if you're a private company. If you're a state-owned enterprise, right, the government owns you, then there is no incentive to turn a profit in these companies, right? The entire focus is on employment, right? Which, that's not a bad thing. And I'm actually a convert to modern monetary theory, but that's a tangent we haven't got time to go down. But these subsidies mean that they not only can they produce things far cheaper than a competitor that isn't being given all this free transport and free money, but it also leads to excess production, right? Because the aim is not to be efficient. The aim is to employ people. So that leads to dumping, right? So particularly high profile has been the steel industry, because China just makes a lot of steel, right? They use a lot of steel, but they have excess production that has been dumped onto global markets at at 20% of the break-even price of everyone else, right? It's destroyed the Australian steel industry and the United States and the EU's, right? The dumping that's going on there is very real. And the US has officially declared them, labelled China a currency manipulator, with some evidence, right? The amount of sales, the amount of foreign currency flowing into their economy, right? They're the biggest exporter in the world. If their currency was a floating currency like every other major economy, then just by the supply and demand, their currency would be far higher, much higher. But it's a fixed currency, right? The Chinese set a peg against the US dollar, and so they control that completely. And so they've been able to depreciate and appreciate their currency as they see fit, to either boost their exports or try and facilitate trade talks, things like that. And the US also blames unemployment on China, or at least the Trump administration does. So Bannon and his ilk see that offshoring industry to China has been the main driver of long-term unemployment and wage stagnation in the US. I'm not sure what China's supposed to do about that. Are they supposed to refuse US companies coming to China to set up factories, right? So I'm not sure about that, but that is one of Trump's accusations. And one that is certainly more robust is that the Chinese market, the Chinese economy, is closed to outsiders, really, especially things that the West or the US would have an advantage in. So high tech, so all their tech companies, they're all blocked, right? Google, right? YouTube or Facebook. These are all mega companies, right? The most profitable companies in the world. They're all US and they're all blocked, right? And that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? But there's lots of ways the Chinese government keep Western companies out. So Trump started raising tariffs on Chinese goods in January 2018 and has continued to do so despite numerous trade talks meetings. Then in late December 2019, the US and Chinese governments announced that they had signed what they called the Phase 1 trade deal. They've come to this agreement. So we're out of the woods, right? We're problem solved. Huh? Yeah, I don't think so. From the Americans' perspective, they want an end to the massive subsidies and the overproduction that leads to, and the dumping that it leads to. And they want intellectual property rights to be protected, to stop forcible transfers, and they want the Chinese market to become a true open economy with access from international competitors, and probably floating the Chinese yuan. But that's not denying that would cause a recession, right? The dislocation that would be to remove all these subsidies, the backing of the Chinese government to all the state-owned enterprises and all large industries. But all the major economies, all the France, Turkey, South Korea, Thailand, South Africa, Brazil, Australia, we've all gone through that process of stopping, massive subsidies to our industries, right? And yes, it's been painful, but the US thinks, well, why can't China do the same? So if we see a return to mercantilist competition where the explicit aim is to put yourself into a trade surplus and your trading partners into a trade deficit, right? Which is what the argument is about between the US and China. This mercantilist approach has led to continual wars in the past where the major powers didn't trade, they traded artillery, and corporations became extensions of the state, and in some ways even more powerful than the state. And they competed not on providing a better product for the consumer, but instead going to war to secure precious resources, to create monopolies, and enslave indigenous people, right? And so this mercantilist idea that trade is a zero-sum game, this has been at the center of all the wars from 1300s onwards, right? So including Imperial Japan's expansion and Nazi Germany's expansion, both of them seeking specifically land and oil, right? So we are living in disturbing times, to say the least. Okay, so we've covered today. What we've covered today is the two versions of where capitalism came from, and the idea of reinvesting your profits to increase production is really the heart of capitalism and what separates it from just wealth. And we saw how states driven by war became the dominant form of political organisation, and how they used this capitalist idea of increasing your productive capacity. They used that to compete economically, to make them stronger in the competition in war, right? And how those two dynamics really sort of fed off each other. So I will leave it there. I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll talk to you next lecture.